In the year 1519, the Aztec Empire stood at its zenith, a sprawling domain of tribute and terror ruled from a city of impossible splendor. At its heart reigned the Tenochtitlan, Moctezuma II, a man revered not as a king, but as a living god, his every word law, his every whim destiny. But a shadow of dread crept over the empire, born of strange and terrifying omens that spoke of an ending. A pillar of fire haunted the night sky, a weeping woman roamed the streets crying for her lost children, and fishermen pulled a monstrous, two-headed creature from the lake. These portents whispered of the return of a long-exiled god, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, prophesied to reclaim his throne. Moctezuma, a ruler steeped in mysticism and superstition, was paralyzed by these signs, his divine authority eroding into private terror. Then, from across the eastern sea, came the most terrible omen of all, floating mountains bearing men with skin like ash and hair like the sun. Hernán Cortés had arrived, his small army of conquistadors a collection of desperate, ruthless men hungry for gold and glory, armed with weapons of thunder and steel. Moctezuma's scouts brought back terrifying reports, painted on cloth for the emperor to see. They depicted men riding giant deer-like beasts, creatures that were one with their masters. They described weapons that spat fire and smoke, felling trees and men with a sound that shattered the sky. To the Aztecs, these were not men. They were teotl, gods or demons, impossible beings from another world, and fear began to poison the emperor's resolve. In his palace of splendor, Moctezuma oscillated between defiance and appeasement. He sent emissaries to meet the strangers, bearing gifts of breathtaking value, discs of solid gold and silver as large as cartwheels, intricate featherwork, and precious jewels. He hoped the treasure would satisfy their greed and compel them to leave. Instead, the gifts acted as blood in the water, revealing the unimaginable wealth of his empire and sealing its doom. Cortés, a master of manipulation, burned his ships upon the shore. There would be no retreat. For his men, it was victory or death, a desperate gamble for the heart of a golden empire. This act of irreversible defiance sent a clear message to Moctezuma. These were not fleeting visitors. They were a plague that had come to stay, a force of nature that could not be placated or turned aside. The Spanish march inland was a blade cutting through the empire's flesh. They encountered the Tlaxcalans, fierce warriors and hereditary enemies of the Aztecs, who had resisted Mexican domination for generations. After a series of brutal, bloody battles, the Tlaxcalans were defeated not by force, but by the sheer, terrifying power of Spanish steel, cannons, and cavalry. The survivors saw an opportunity for revenge against their hated overlords. An alliance was forged in blood and hatred. The Tlaxcalans, thousands strong, joined Cortés, their knowledge of the land and their burning desire to see Tenochtitlan fall, providing the conquistadors with the army they desperately needed. They guided the Spanish, fed them, and swelled their ranks with warriors eager for Aztec blood. Moctezuma's greatest enemies were now marching alongside the strange gods, and the path to his city was laid open. The next obstacle was the holy city of Cholula, a place loyal to Moctezuma. The Spanish were welcomed, but Cortés, fueled by Tlaxcalan warnings of a supposed ambush, decided on a show of force that would echo across the empire. He gathered the city's unarmed nobles and priests in a central plaza under the pretense of a parley. The trap was set, the gates were sealed, and the air grew thick with a silent, murderous tension. At a signal, the massacre began. Cannons roared, and musket fire tore through the defenseless crowd. Conquistadors on horseback charged into the plaza, their lances and swords rising and falling in a sickening, rhythmic slaughter. The Tlaxcalans, given their chance for vengeance, swarmed into the city, killing, looting, and burning. For hours, the screams of the dying filled the air as a holy city was turned into a charnel house. News of the Cholula massacre spread like a pestilence. It was a message written in blood. designed to terrorize Moctezuma and shatter the will of his subjects. The emperor, who had believed he was dealing with men or perhaps capricious gods, now understood he was facing monsters. His indecision deepened, his council was divided, and his empire, built on fear, was now consumed by it. Every path he considered seemed to lead to ruin. Despite the terror, Moctezuma made his final, fateful decision. He would not fight the invaders at the gates. Instead, he would welcome them into the heart of his empire, into Tenochtitlan itself. Perhaps he believed he could control them, or that their divine nature demanded reverence. More likely, he was a man paralyzed by prophecy, convinced that resistance was futile, and chose to walk willingly into the jaws of the beast. On November 8, 1519, the conquistadors marched across the causeway into Tenochtitlan. What they saw stunned them into silence. It was a city of dreams, larger and more magnificent than any in Europe, with gleaming white pyramids, vast plazas, and intricate canals. To hardened soldiers like Bernal Diaz del Castillo, it felt as if they were walking into a sorcerer's enchantment, a place of impossible beauty that was also profoundly alien and menacing. The two leaders met. Cortés, the ambitious captain from a backwater kingdom, and Moctezuma, the divine ruler of a continent-spanning empire. Moctezuma, carried on a litter adorned with quetzal feathers and gold, was a vision of majesty. He welcomed Cortés with gifts and flowery speeches, calling him a returned lord. Cortés, ever the opportunist, played his part, dismounting and attempting to embrace the emperor, a shocking breach of protocol that was quickly stopped by horrified Aztec nobles. The Spanish were housed in the palace of Axiacatl, Moctezuma's late father. It was a vast, opulent complex, a city within a city. Here, they were treated as honored guests, lavished with food, servants, and more gold. But the conquistadors were not guests, they were predators. They felt like mice in a trap, surrounded by tens of thousands of Aztec warriors, their unease growing with every passing moment in the heart of this powerful, strange city. Their unease quickly turned to avarice. While exploring their quarters, the Spanish discovered a hidden doorway sealed with fresh plaster. Driven by suspicion and greed, they broke through the wall. Inside, they found Moctezuma's secret treasure chamber, a room overflowing with gold bars, precious stones, intricate jewelry, and idols. The sight drove them mad with desire, transforming their fear into a desperate, murderous resolve. Cortés knew his position was precarious. He was a guest whose welcome could expire at any moment. He needed a guarantee of his safety, an insurance policy. Using a skirmish on the coast as a pretext, an incident in which several Spaniards were killed by an Aztec lord, Cortés devised his most audacious plan yet. He would seize the emperor himself, taking the god-king hostage in his own palace. With a small contingent of his most ruthless men, Cortés went to Moctezuma's palace. The mood was tense, the pleasantries thin. Cortés accused the emperor of ordering the coastal attack. Moctezuma, shocked, denied it vehemently. Then came the demand. To ensure his innocence and the safety of the Spanish, Moctezuma must come with them to live in their quarters. It was a request so outrageous, so insulting, it was barely comprehensible. For hours, Moctezuma argued, pleaded, and offered alternatives. He would hand over the guilty lord, he would give them more gold, he would even offer his own children as hostages. But Cortés was immovable. As the debate raged, one of the Spanish captains, known for his violent temper, grew impatient. He drew his sword and shouted that they should either take the emperor or kill him on the spot. The glint of steel and the raw threat finally broke Moctezuma's will. The god-king of the Aztec Empire, the Tenochtitlan whose subjects could not even look him in the eye, walked from his palace as a prisoner. He was forced to tell his own guards and nobles that he was going with the strangers of his own free will as a guest. The lie was transparent, the humiliation absolute. As he was led away, the divine aura that had surrounded him for his entire life evaporated, leaving only a frightened, defeated man. Moctezuma's life in the Spanish-occupied palace became a surreal puppet show. He was still treated with a semblance of respect, attended by his servants, and consulted on matters of state. Yet he was a prisoner, constantly watched, his every command now subject to the approval of his captors. He became the mouthpiece for Cortés, issuing orders that benefited the Spanish. His authority used to dismantle his own empire piece by piece. The Aztec lord accused of the coastal attack was brought to Tenochtitlan. Under duress from Moctezuma, now a Spanish puppet, the lord and his captains confessed. Cortés's sentence was swift and barbaric. In the main plaza, in full view of the horrified populace, they were burned alive. To add to the horror and humiliation, the pyre was built using the sacred spears and shields from the Aztec armory. During the execution, Cortés took his cruelty a step further. He ordered that Moctezuma be put in chains. The cold iron was clamped onto the ankles of the man who was once a god. Moctezuma wept, not in pain, but in sheer soul-crushing humiliation. His nobles and servants could do nothing but weep with him, wiping his feet with their own cloaks. The ultimate degradation was complete. The emperor was not just a prisoner, but a common criminal. With Moctezuma fully under their control, the Spanish began to systematically plunder the city. The secret treasure of Axiacatl was brought out into the open. The conquistadors, caring nothing for the artistry or cultural value, ordered the Aztec goldsmiths to melt it all down. Priceless works of art, centuries of heritage, were destroyed, rendered into crude bars of gold for easier transport and division. The sound of hammers breaking apart sacred objects was the sound of a culture being murdered. The Aztec nobility grew increasingly restless. Their leader was a captive, their temples were being disrespected, and their wealth was being stolen. Cuitlahuac, Moctezuma's brother and a far more aggressive warrior, became the focal point of a growing resistance. They saw Moctezuma's compliance not as a strategy, but as cowardice and betrayal. The whispers of rebellion grew louder, a storm gathering just outside the palace walls. Cortés's situation became more complicated with the arrival of a new threat, not from the Aztecs, but from his own people. A much larger Spanish force, led by Panfilo de Narvaez, had landed on the coast. They were sent by the governor of Cuba to arrest Cortés for insubordination. He was now caught between a resentful native population and a rival Spanish army, with his life and his conquest hanging by a thread. In a daring move, Cortés decided to confront Narvaez directly. He took a small portion of his forces, the most loyal and battle-hardened, and marched back to the coast. He left his lieutenant, the hot-headed and unstable Pedro de Alvarado, in command of the garrison in Tenochtitlan. He entrusted Alvarado with their most valuable asset, the captive Emperor Moctezuma, the key to their survival. Cortés, through a combination of surprise, bribery, and the sheer force of his reputation, defeated Narvaez's much larger army in a swift night attack. He incorporated the defeated soldiers into his own forces, swelling his numbers significantly. He now had the men and artillery to truly conquer the empire. But while he was securing his victory on the coast, back in Tenochtitlan, Alvarado's paranoia was about to unleash hell. In Tenochtitlan, the time had come for the festival of Toxcatl, one of the most important ceremonies in the Aztec calendar, honoring the war god Huitzilopochtli. The nobility asked Alvarado for permission to hold the celebration in the main temple courtyard. Alvarado agreed, but his mind was poisoned by fear. He saw the gathering of so many warriors and nobles not as a religious ceremony, but as the prelude to an attack. Thousands of the Aztec elite, the flower of their nobility and priesthood, gathered in the sacred precinct. They were unarmed, dressed in their finest ceremonial attire of feathers, gold, and jewels, their bodies painted for the dance. As the drums began to beat and the great serpent dance commenced, they were lost in a religious ecstasy, a vibrant, pulsating celebration of their culture and their gods, completely unaware of the doom that surrounded them. Alvarado made his move. He ordered the temple gates sealed, trapping the celebrants inside. On his signal, the Spanish soldiers, along with their Tlaxcalan allies, charged into the courtyard with swords drawn. They fell upon the unarmed, dancing nobles with a horrifying savagery. What was a sacred festival became a one-sided slaughter, a bloodbath of unimaginable cruelty. The courtyard became a slick floor of blood and viscera. The Spanish hacked off arms and legs, disemboweled priests, and decapitated dancers. They slipped on the entrails of their victims as they pursued anyone still moving. The screams of the dying mingled with the frantic, now horrified beat of the drums. The Tlaxcalans joined in with relish, settling old scores in the most brutal way imaginable. The sounds of the massacre reached the city beyond the temple walls. A low roar of horror and disbelief soon swelled into a tidal wave of fury. The people of Tenochtitlan, who had so far tolerated the foreigner's presence, were now galvanized by this ultimate act of sacrilege and betrayal. Grabbing whatever weapons they could find, spears, clubs, even stones, they swarmed towards the sacred precinct, their grief transformed into a burning, unified rage. Alvarado and his men, their murderous work complete, were forced to retreat to their fortified palace. The Aztec attack was immediate and relentless. A hail of stones, arrows, and spears rained down on the compound. Warriors swarmed the walls, attempting to scale them, only to be cut down by crossbows and cannons. The city, once a peaceful host, had become a furious, buzzing hornet's nest, and the Spanish were trapped inside. It was into this inferno that Cortés returned. His reinforced army fought its way back across the causeway and into the palace, but it was no triumphant return. The streets were eerily empty, the markets closed, the bridges razed. The silence was more terrifying than any battle. They had not relieved a siege, they had merely entered the trap themselves. Now the entire Spanish force was imprisoned in the heart of a city that wanted every last one of them dead. The Aztec assault redoubled with furious intensity. They set fire to the palace walls, their war cries a constant, deafening roar that gave the Spanish no rest. The fighting was day and night, a brutal, close-quarters struggle for survival. The conquistadors, for all their superior weaponry, were vastly outnumbered and running low on food, water, and gunpowder. The specter of death, either by combat or starvation, loomed over every man. In his desperation, Cortés turned to his captive. He believed that Moctezuma still held sway over his people. He forced the emperor, now a broken man, to go to the palace rooftop and speak to the furious crowds below. He was to command them to lay down their arms, to tell them the Spanish would leave peacefully if only they were allowed to. It was a final, desperate gamble, using the emperor's voice as a shield. When Moctezuma appeared on the roof, a momentary hush fell over the crowd. For a lifetime, they had revered this man as a god, his presence enough to command absolute obedience. He began to speak, his voice weak, reciting the words his captors had given him. He pleaded for peace, promising the Spanish would depart. But the spell of his divinity was broken, shattered by his captivity and the massacre in the temple. The silence did not last. It was broken by a cry of outrage, an accusation of cowardice. The crowd erupted not with obedience, but with scorn and fury. How could he speak for these murderers? He was not their Tlaxcala anymore. He was a woman, a whore for the Spanish. The air, once filled with reverence for him, now filled with insults and curses. His own people had utterly rejected him. Then the stones began to fly. The crowd, in its rage, unleashed a volley of rocks and arrows at the rooftop. Spanish soldiers tried to shield the emperor with their bucklers, but it was too late. One large stone struck Moctezuma on the head, sending him crumpling to the ground. The people he had once ruled, the people he was trying to save, had failed him. The ultimate act of repudiation was complete. The historical accounts of what happened next diverge, forever clouding the emperor's final moments. The Spanish version claims that Moctezuma, gravely injured and stripped of his will to live, refused all food and aid. He lingered for a few days, lost in a deep depression born of his public humiliation and physical wounds, before finally succumbing to his injuries. In this telling, his spirit was broken long before his body gave out. However, Aztec sources tell a much darker, more violent story. They contend that Moctezuma did not die from the stones thrown by his own people. They claim that once the emperor was no longer useful to the besieged and desperate Spanish, they murdered him themselves. In these accounts, he was stabbed to death with swords, along with other high-ranking nobles held captive, his body simply another piece of baggage to be discarded before their escape. Regardless of the exact cause, Moctezuma II was dead. His body, once the most sacred vessel in the empire, was unceremoniously thrown out of the palace by the Spanish. It was dumped onto the street below, a final gesture of contempt. His people, who had stoned him days before, now looked upon his corpse with a mixture of pity, grief, and confusion. The great Tenochtitlan, the center of their universe, was now just a broken corpse in the mud. With Moctezuma dead and the city baying for their blood, the Spanish knew they had to escape or die. Cortés planned a desperate nighttime breakout across the causeways, which the Aztecs had partially destroyed. To muffle the sound of their horses, they wrapped their hooves in cloth. They also built a portable wooden bridge to span the gaps in the causeway. It was a mad dash for survival through the heart of an enemy city. The escape began under the cover of a drizzling rain. The Spanish, burdened with as much stolen gold as they could carry, moved silently onto the dark causeway. But their luck did not hold. An Aztec sentry, a woman drawing water, spotted them and raised the alarm. Her piercing shriek was answered by the deep, booming sound of the great drum on top of the Templo Mayor. Its rhythmic beat, a death knell that called the entire city to arms. What followed was a nightmare of blood and water. The Aztecs attacked from all sides. Canoe-borne warriors swarmed the causeway, firing arrows and jabbing with long spears. The Spanish, packed tightly together and weighed down by gold, were easy targets. Their portable bridge became stuck and useless, creating a horrifying bottleneck. Men and horses tumbled into the dark water of the lake, dragged down by their armor and their greed. The gap in the causeway became filled with the bodies of the dead and dying, creating a gruesome, makeshift bridge. Survivors scrambled over the corpses of their own comrades to escape. Pedro de Alvarado, in a legendary feat of desperation, was said to have used his lance to vault across the gap. The water churned with blood and the flailing limbs of drowning men, their stolen gold pulling them to a muddy grave. By the time the shattered remnants of Cortés's army reached the mainland, the devastation was clear. Over half of his Spanish soldiers were dead, along with thousands of their Tlaxcalan allies. They had lost all their cannons, most of their horses, and nearly all of the plundered gold. Cortés, the famously stoic commander, is said to have wept at the sight of his losses. This night would forever be known as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. Back in Tenochtitlan, a new emperor was chosen, Cuitlahuac, Moctezuma's brother and a fierce advocate for war. He was everything Moctezuma was not: decisive, aggressive, and utterly committed to exterminating the invaders. He set about rebuilding the city's defenses, raising a new army, and attempting to forge alliances with other native states, including the Tlaxcalans, warning them that the Spanish were a threat to them all. The Spanish, however, had left behind a far more insidious and deadly weapon than swords or cannons: disease. A single slave in Narvaez's party had been carrying smallpox, a sickness completely unknown in the Americas. With no natural immunity, the indigenous population was defenseless. The disease spread through Tenochtitlan like wildfire, a biological holocaust that turned the city into a massive, open grave. The plague killed with terrifying speed and efficiency. It wiped out entire families, leaving no one to even bury the dead. The great warrior Cuitlahuac, who had led the glorious victory of La Noche Triste, was struck down by the disease after ruling for only 80 days. The pestilence killed an estimated 40% of the city's population, shattering the Aztecs' morale and their ability to fight. While the Aztecs were dying, Cortés was rebuilding. In the safety of Tlaxcala, he rested his men, gathered reinforcements from Cuba, and planned his revenge. His most brilliant strategic move was to order the construction of a fleet of 13 small brigantines, warships to be built in pieces and then carried over the mountains. He would not attack Tenochtitlan by land again. He would besiege it by water, cutting it off from the outside world. The Aztecs chose their final emperor, a young, courageous noble named Cuauhtémoc, whose name meant descending eagle. He was a hardened warrior who knew there would be no negotiation, only a fight to the death. He inherited a city devastated by plague and facing an enemy that was now stronger than ever. His reign would be a short, brutal, and heroic last stand for his people. Cortés launched his siege. His newly built fleet gave him control of the lake, allowing him to block the causeways and prevent any food or fresh water from entering the city. His armies, swelled with tens of thousands of indigenous allies, attacked from all three causeways simultaneously. Tenochtitlan, the magnificent island city, was now a trap, its people facing death by starvation, thirst, or the sword. The fighting for Tenochtitlan was brutal beyond measure. Every street, every house, every canal became a battlefield. The Aztecs, though starving and weakened, fought with the ferocity of cornered animals. They pulled Spanish soldiers from the causeways, dragging them to the tops of the pyramids to be sacrificed in full view of their horrified comrades. The psychological warfare was as intense as the physical combat. Cortés realized that to take the city, he would have to destroy it. He adopted a scorched earth policy, demolishing every building his forces captured to eliminate hiding places for Aztec defenders. The beautiful city that had so amazed the Spanish upon their arrival was systematically leveled, its magnificent temples and palaces reduced to rubble. The conquest was also an act of total annihilation. For months, the city held out. The people ate lizards, rats, and the bark from trees. They drank the brackish water from the lake. The stench of death was overpowering, as there was no one left to bury the thousands who died from battle and starvation. Yet, under the leadership of Cuauhtémoc, they refused to surrender. They would die for their city, for their gods, for their way of life. The end came on August 13th, 1521. The last pocket of Aztec resistance was cornered in the Tlatelolco district of the city. As Spanish forces closed in, a decorated war canoe was spotted trying to flee across the lake. A Spanish brigantine gave chase and captured it. On board was the last emperor, Cuauhtémoc, trying to escape with his family to continue the fight from elsewhere. Brought before Cortés, Cuauhtémoc showed no fear. He touched the dagger on the conquistador's belt and spoke. "I have done what I was obliged to do to defend my city and my people," he said. "I can do no more. Take this dagger and kill me." But Cortés had no intention of granting him a warrior's death. The emperor was far more valuable alive, as a tool to find the gold that had been lost during La Noche Triste. The Spanish victory was followed by an orgy of looting and violence. The city's surviving defenders were slaughtered, and its women were brutalized. The conquerors, maddened by the lack of treasure, as most of the gold had been lost in the lake, began to torture their captives for information. The beautiful city of dreams had become a hellscape of fire, blood, and suffering. To force him to reveal the location of the lost treasure, Cuauhtémoc was tortured. His feet, along with those of the Lord of Tacuba, were slowly roasted over a fire. Despite the excruciating pain, the last Aztec emperor refused to speak, bearing the agony with a stoicism that amazed even his tormentors. When his fellow captive cried out in pain, Cuauhtémoc is said to have rebuked him, asking, "Am I, by any chance, in some kind of delight or bath?" Cuauhtémoc survived the torture, his feet permanently maimed. For several years, he was kept as a high-status prisoner, a living symbol of the defeated empire. Cortés dragged him along on a grueling expedition to Honduras, fearing to leave such an influential figure behind where he might inspire a rebellion. The fallen eagle was now a chained eagle, a trophy of the conquest. In 1525, during the Honduras expedition, Cortés claimed to have uncovered a plot by Cuauhtémoc to kill him and his men. Whether the plot was real or a convenient excuse to eliminate a potential threat is unknown. Without a trial, Cortés sentenced the last Aztec emperor to death. Far from the ruins of his great city, in the middle of an unforgiving jungle, the final act of the Aztec tragedy was about to unfold. Cuauhtémoc, the last eagle, the final Tlatani of the once mighty Aztec Empire, was executed by hanging from a ceiba tree. His death was not a glorious sacrifice on a pyramid altar, but a squalid, ignominious end in a foreign land. With his death, the line of Aztec emperors was extinguished forever, and the last symbol of resistance was gone. The conquest was, at last, truly complete. The story of Moctezuma is a tragedy of a man caught between two worlds. He was a ruler from an old world of prophecy and ritual, confronted by a new world of steel, gunpowder, and relentless ambition. His indecision, born of religious terror and a fatalistic worldview, opened the door for a handful of determined invaders to topple one of the greatest empires the Americas had ever known. His captivity was more than the imprisonment of a man. It was the caging of a god, and in that cage, the spirit of his people began to wither. His humiliating death, whether at the hands of his own subjects or his foreign captors, was the final, brutal symbol of his empire's collapse. He was a leader who, faced with an unimaginable crisis, failed to lead, and his failure was paid for with the blood of millions and the death of a civilization. On the ashes of Tenochtitlan, the Spanish would build Mexico City. On the ruins of the great temple, they would erect a cathedral. The old gods would be buried, their books burned, their people enslaved. The dreadful fate of the last true Aztec emperor was not just a personal tragedy. It was the violent birth of a new continent, a future built upon the bones of the world that Moctezuma II had lost.